One of the most important warnings in human history was delivered weeks before disaster. And the man who sent it was mocked, ignored, and left to die. He knew the exact date Hitler would launch the largest invasion in history. 3 million soldiers, 170 divisions, the moment the war would explode. He told Moscow everything. They called him a liar. Millions of people would pay the price for that mistake. But the real story isn't just that a spy predicted the invasion. It's how a drunken journalist sitting in Tokyo somehow knew Hitler's most guarded secret, before many German officials did. And how the mask he built was so convincing that an entire empire trusted him. A German journalist named Richard Sorge sits in his cluttered office, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and classified documents that should have been impossible to obtain. He is composing what will become one of the most important intelligence cables of the Second World War. A cable that could save 20 million lives. A cable that will be ignored. Sorge's codename is Ramsay. For 8 years he has operated the most successful Soviet spy ring in Asia, cultivating sources at the highest levels of the Japanese government and the German embassy. His network has penetrated so deeply that he receives information sometimes before the officials it concerns. And now, in the spring of 1941, that network has delivered something extraordinary. The exact date of Operation Barbarossa. Sorge's intelligence is not vague, it is not hedged, it is precise to the point of absurdity. 170 German divisions, 3 million men. The largest invasion force in human history, aimed directly at the Soviet Union. Target date, June 22nd, 1941. He transmits everything to Moscow Center, along with details of the German order of battle, the axis of advance, the operational objectives. It is, by any measure, perfect intelligence. Moscow's response arrives within days. Sorge's handler informs him that Comrade Stalin has reviewed the material personally. The verdict is not what Sorge expected. Stalin calls him a little shit who has set up factories and brothels in Japan. The reference to brothels is not entirely inaccurate. Sorge's cover as a dissolute foreign correspondent involves considerable drinking, womanizing, and the cultivation of a reputation for excess. But Stalin's fury goes deeper than personal distaste. The Soviet dictator has convinced himself that any warning of German attack is British disinformation, designed to drive a wedge between Moscow and Berlin. He has already ignored warnings from his own military intelligence. He has dismissed reports from the Soviet embassy in Berlin. He has rejected information from a German defector who crossed the border with operational plans in hand. Now he rejects Sorge. The pattern is breathtaking in its consistency. In the months before Barbarossa, Stalin received over 80 separate intelligence warnings about the coming invasion. 80. From sources across Europe, from his own generals, from agents embedded in the German High Command. He dismissed them all. When his foreign intelligence chief presented yet another warning, Stalin scrawled across the report, "Tell your source to go to hell." June 22nd arrives exactly as Sorge predicted. German forces pour across the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The Red Army, caught completely unprepared, suffers catastrophic losses. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies cease to exist. Within months, German forces stand at the gates of Moscow. Richard Sorge had given Stalin everything he needed: the date, the strength, the direction. Perfect intelligence, delivered weeks in advance. And none of it mattered. This is the paradox that haunts every intelligence service. Information is worthless if no one believes it. The best spy in the world cannot save lives if his masters refuse to listen. Sorge would be arrested by Japanese counterintelligence in October 1941, tortured, and eventually hanged. He died knowing that his greatest triumph had been his greatest failure. But Sorge's story raises a question that the official histories never adequately answer. How did a German journalist, living a life of calculated excess in Tokyo, gain access to Hitler's most closely guarded military secret? The answer lies not in Japan, but in England, in the quiet courtyards of Cambridge University, in the drawing rooms of the British establishment, in a recruitment operation so audacious that Moscow Center itself refused to believe it had succeeded. To understand how one man could know the fate of millions, we must first declassify the perfect identity he constructed. A mask so convincing, it fooled an entire empire. So how did a German journalist manage to obtain classified cables from inside the German embassy itself? The answer lies in understanding that Richard Sorge was not merely a spy. He was a master of human manipulation, operating behind the most convincing cover Moscow ever constructed. On paper, Sorge was everything the Third Reich admired. A decorated veteran of the First World War, wounded 3 times fighting for the Kaiser. A respected correspondent for the prestigious Frankfurter Zeitung. And most importantly, a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. He attended party functions. He gave toasts to the Führer. He wore the swastika pin on his lapel with apparent pride. The performance was flawless because Sorge understood something fundamental about deception. The best cover is not the one you hide behind, it is the one you inhabit completely. Moscow had sent him to Tokyo in 1933 with a single burning question. What will Japan do? The Soviets were terrified of a two-front war. Germany pressing from the west, Japan from the east. Stalin needed to know Japanese intentions, and Tokyo was a critical blind spot for Soviet intelligence. They had almost no reliable sources inside the Japanese government or military establishment. Sorge's solution was characteristically bold. He would not try to recruit Japanese officials directly. Instead, he would infiltrate the one place in Tokyo where German and Japanese strategic thinking converged: the German embassy. His target was Eugen Ott, the German military attaché who would later become ambassador. Sorge cultivated him with the patience of a gardener tending a prized orchid. They drank together at Tokyo's foreign clubs. They played chess. They discussed philosophy and politics late into the night. Sorge made himself indispensable, offering sharp analysis on Japanese affairs that Ott began incorporating into his own reports to Berlin. The friendship deepened. Ott began sharing diplomatic gossip, then confidential assessments. Then, incredibly, he started asking Sorge to help him draft cables to the foreign ministry. The Soviet spy was literally writing German diplomatic communications. But Sorge wanted more. He charmed Ott's wife, Helma, who found the dashing journalist far more exciting than her dutiful husband. Some historians believe the relationship became romantic. What is certain is that Helma began passing Sorge documents from her husband's briefcase. Cables marked with the highest classification Berlin could assign. By 1941, Richard Sorge had achieved something unprecedented. He had unfettered access to the German embassy's inner sanctum. He attended staff meetings. He read top-secret communications sent directly from Ribbentrop's foreign ministry. He knew what Hitler was telling his ambassador, sometimes before the ambassador himself had fully processed the implications. The German embassy became, in effect, a branch office of Soviet intelligence, and no one suspected a thing. Ott trusted Sorge completely. When colleagues occasionally raised eyebrows at the journalist's extraordinary access, the ambassador dismissed their concerns. Sorge was a patriot, a party member, a friend. This was the architecture of Sorge's genius. He did not steal secrets through dead drops and shadowy meetings. He had them handed to him over brandy and cigars by men who considered him their most trusted confidant. Sorge was a master of extracting secrets, but he wasn't working alone. Getting the information was only half the battle. The other half was a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out over the airwaves of a city on high alert. Richard Sorge gathered the intelligence, but intelligence is worthless if it cannot reach Moscow. And getting secrets out of wartime Tokyo was perhaps the most dangerous job in the entire network. The man responsible for this impossible task was Max Clausen, German by birth, communist by conviction, radio operator by necessity. Every piece of intelligence Sorge collected, every stolen document, every overheard conversation, every insight gleaned from drunken diplomats, all of it funneled through Clausen's hands. And those hands operated a shortwave radio transmitter hidden in various locations across Tokyo, sending coded messages to a receiving station 4,000 miles away in Vladivostok. Consider what this meant in practice. The Kempeitai, Japan's secret police, were methodical, brutal, and obsessed with foreign spies. They operated radio direction-finding equipment throughout the capital. 3 bearings from 3 listening posts, and they could triangulate your position within a city block. Clausen knew this. Everyone in the network knew this. The math was simple and terrifying. Transmit too long from any single location, and the Kempeitai would find you. So Clausen developed a routine of constant movement. Never the same location twice in a row. Never more than 20 minutes of transmission time. The radio itself had to be broken down, transported, reassembled, all without attracting attention in a city where foreigners were watched and followed as a matter of course. The encoding process was equally painstaking. Raw intelligence would arrive from Sorge, sometimes scrawled notes, sometimes verbal briefings committed to memory. Clausen would convert this into a numerical cipher, groups of 5 digits that looked like meaningless static to anyone who intercepted them. Only the receiving station in Vladivostok possessed the key to translate these number strings back into words. There were nights when Clausen's fingers trembled over the telegraph key. Not from cold, though Tokyo winters could be bitter. From fear. Pure, rational fear. One mistake, one suspicious neighbor, one Kempeitai patrol investigating an unusual radio signal, and the entire network would collapse. Sorge, Ozaki, Miyagi, Vokalich. Every member of the ring was connected by invisible threads, and Clausen's radio was the spider at the center of the web. The network had one rule that everyone understood without it ever being spoken aloud. No member could know everything, but every member could destroy everything. A single arrest under Kempeitai interrogation, which was legendary for its brutality, could unravel years of careful work in a matter of hours. Yet despite these impossible conditions, the ring functioned. For 8 years, Clausen's silent radio reached across the Pacific, carrying secrets that would reshape the war. The warning about Operation Barbarossa had been one such message. In May of 1941, Sorge transmitted the precise date of the German invasion, June 22nd. Stalin received the intelligence. Stalin ignored it. When the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border exactly as Sorge had predicted, 20 million Soviet citizens would eventually pay the price for that disbelief. But the ring kept transmitting. And in the autumn of 1941, as German tanks drove toward Moscow and the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of annihilation, Sorge obtained one final piece of intelligence. It came from his Japanese sources, confirmed through multiple channels, verified and re-verified because he understood that Moscow had ignored him once and might ignore him again. This time, he could not afford to be dismissed. Because this intelligence, if believed, would allow Stalin to make a single decision that could determine whether the Soviet Union survived or fell. Their warning about the German invasion had been ignored. But as the Wehrmacht drove towards Moscow, Sorge had one last chance to send a piece of intelligence so vital it would change the outcome of the entire war. Autumn 1941. The Soviet Union is dying. German tanks have pushed to within striking distance of Moscow. The Kremlin is preparing to evacuate. Government archives are being burned. Stalin, the man who trusted no one, faces his greatest nightmare. Not just the Wehrmacht at his gates, something worse. The possibility of a second front. Because 8,000 kilometers to the east, The Imperial Japanese Army sits poised on the Manchurian border. 700,000 troops, battle-hardened, waiting. If Japan strikes north into Siberia while Germany strikes from the west, the Soviet Union will be crushed between two hammers. Stalin knows this. Hitler knows this. The Japanese High Command knows this. The only question is what Tokyo will decide. And in a small house in Tokyo, Richard Sorge knows something that Stalin desperately needs to hear. For months, Sorge has been working this single question with the obsessive focus of a man who understands the stakes. Through Ambassador Ott, through his Japanese sources, through Ozaki Hotsumi's connections to the highest levels of the Japanese government, he has been piecing together the puzzle. In September 1941, the pieces finally fall into place. The Imperial Council has made its decision. Japan will not strike north against the Soviet Union. Japan will strike south. Against the Dutch East Indies, against British Malaya, against the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Sorge transmits immediately. The message is short, definitive, arguably the most consequential intelligence transmission of the entire war. Japan has committed to the southern strategy. The Siberian border is safe. Now consider what this means. Stalin had been keeping 18 divisions in Siberia, elite troops, winter-hardened, equipped for conditions that would freeze German soldiers in their tracks. These divisions had been held back as insurance against a Japanese attack that Sorge now confirmed would never come. Within weeks of receiving Sorge's intelligence, Stalin begins the transfer. Division after division boards trains heading west. Fresh troops, fresh equipment, fresh hope. They arrive at the Moscow front in late November and early December, just as the German advance reaches its furthest point. The timing is extraordinary. These Siberian divisions do not simply reinforce the line, they lead the counter-offensive. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launches its winter assault. German forces, exhausted, frozen, overextended, are thrown back from the gates of Moscow. The Wehrmacht suffers its first major defeat of the war. Military historians still debate whether Sorge's intelligence alone saved Moscow. The Siberian transfer was already being considered. Soviet intelligence had other sources suggesting Japanese intentions. But what no one disputes is this. Sorge provided confirmation at the critical moment. He gave Stalin the confidence to act, to gamble everything on a single piece of intelligence from a German journalist drinking champagne at the Nazi embassy in Tokyo. The irony cuts deep. For years, Moscow had dismissed Sorge's warnings. His intelligence about Operation Barbarossa had been ignored. His reports had been filed away as suspected disinformation. But this message, this final, crucial transmission, arrived at the moment when Stalin had no choice but to listen. When the alternative was the fall of the Soviet capital. He had saved Moscow. He had arguably altered the course of the war. But just as his intelligence reached its destination, the net that had been closing around him for years finally snapped shut. The end came not from a grand failure of tradecraft, but from the most mundane of mistakes. October 1941. While Sorge was saving Moscow from destruction, the Kempeitai were following an entirely different thread. A minor figure, a Japanese communist named Ito Ritsu, picked up on suspicion of distributing illegal pamphlets. Under interrogation, he gave up a name. Then that name gave up another. The thread kept pulling. Within weeks, the entire Ramsay network began to unravel. One by one, Sorge's agents were arrested. Max Clausen, Branko Vukelic, Hotsumi Ozaki. And finally, on October 18, 1941, the Kempeitai came for Richard Sorge himself. The man who had penetrated the German embassy, the spy who had predicted Barbarossa, the agent who had just saved the Soviet Union, caught because of a pamphleteer with a loose tongue. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so catastrophic. What followed was not swift justice, but a slow, grinding process of interrogation and legal maneuvering. Sorge proved as formidable in captivity as he had been in the field. He gave the Japanese what they already knew, nothing more. He protected sources still in play. He played the interrogation game with the same mastery he had brought to intelligence gathering. For 2 years he sat in Sugamo prison. 2 years of appeals. 2 years of diplomatic silence from Moscow. 2 years of waiting for a rescue that would never come. November 7th, 1944. The anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The day the Soviet Union celebrated the birth of the workers' state. On that morning, Richard Sorge walked to the gallows in Sugamo prison and was executed by hanging. He was 49 years old. The timing was almost certainly deliberate. The Japanese understood symbolism. They killed him on the holiest day of the communist calendar. But here is where the story turns from tragedy to something far more disturbing. The Soviet Union, the nation Sorge had served since 1929, the country he had risked everything to protect, the power whose capital he had quite literally saved from German occupation, did not acknowledge him. They did not demand his release. They did not negotiate for his freedom. They did not even admit he existed. When the war ended and the full scope of Soviet espionage began to emerge, Moscow's official position on Richard Sorge was simple. They had never heard of him. He was not their agent. His intelligence had never reached them. The man was a fiction. For nearly 20 years, Richard Sorge was officially erased. A non-person in the country he had served. A traitor in the history books of the nation he had saved. Why? The reasons remain murky, buried in the paranoid logic of Stalinist bureaucracy. Perhaps his German heritage made him suspect. Perhaps his independence troubled handlers who preferred control. Perhaps admitting his existence would require explaining why his warnings about Barbarossa had been ignored for so long. Whatever the calculation, the result was the same. Silence. Absolute and deliberate silence. It was not until 1964, 2 decades after his death, that Nikita Khrushchev finally acknowledged the truth. Richard Sorge was posthumously declared a hero of the Soviet Union. Streets were named after him. Stamps bore his face. The ghost was finally given a body. But by then, what did it matter? The man who had lived in shadows died in shadows. The spy who knew the truth about Barbarossa was consumed by the very ideology he had fought for. He had believed in a cause larger than himself, and that cause had found him expendable. This is the paradox at the heart of espionage. The most valuable intelligence often comes from the most flawed messengers. Sorge was a drunk, a womanizer, a man of enormous appetites and contradictions. He was also one of the most consequential spies in human history. Both things were true. Neither cancelled the other. Richard Sorge's story is a declassified file on the nature of sacrifice. A chilling testament that in the world of shadows, the price of truth is often paid in silence. He gave everything to a nation that gave him nothing in return, not even the dignity of being remembered.